When speaking of the left, we often default to a few common talking points. They don't understand human nature, they're utopians, they disrespect history and tradition, they have no idea how economics and incentives works, and on and on and on. While there is truth to all of these claims, I think the most accurate cliche is how often and eagerly they will turn on one another. In fact, it's such a common occurrence at this point that for as long as there has been a left-right distinction within politics, the left has been visibly infighting. The history of leftist ideology is filled with the corpses of those who strayed from orthodoxy, or those who thought that they'd all gone far enough when the rest of the crowd had only just gotten started. However, we must recognise that although purges are commonplace among the left, this has not stopped them from infiltrating all of our major institutions and pulling our culture their way for at least a century. Let's examine some practical and philosophical reasons for why the left intermittently purges itself first. The most common problem is that the leading revolutionaries are rarely members of the class that they supposedly stand for. So, while many left-wingers will pay lip service to assisting society's downtrodden workers, these movements are always led by educated, upper-middle-class intellectuals who resent their wealthy parents, somewhat like Karl Marx himself. The benefit of being an educated, upper-middle-class intellectual is making connections through educational institutions to other like-minded fellows. The working man has very little use for lofty and impractical ideas in his day-to-day life, leaving little room for intellectuals in the market to make any money from their ideas. Intellectuals recognised this and adapted accordingly, shifting their role to one of justifying ever-expanding state power and control. For within such a state system, the intellectual can find ready employment at universities and schools or public programs, whereas the free market would toss his unmarketable ideas and vague intellectualizing aside. Without these agitators forming coalitions together, left-wing movements would not gain the popularity and momentum that they do. What this manifests as in the modern day is an ego trip for many wealthy and privileged elites, who get to elevate their own position within society and alleviate any guilt that they feel for their immense and unearned privilege. The power that comes along with such influence in society doesn't hurt either. These modern leftists begin not from strict orthodox Marxism, but instead from the tradition of Marxism-Leninism, Maoism, or even the freakish hybrid stepchild, neo-Marxism. Unlike their philosophical precursor, Leninism and Maoism originate from people who were actively trying to lead revolutions in their home states, and were persecuted for doing so by the authorities. Secrecy was paramount if they wanted to survive, and vast underground networks formed, attracting literal criminals like Stalin, who was a bank robber, into positions where they could easily seize power. And so the philosophies that these people formed have led to similarly treacherous and unprincipled types attaching themselves to grassroots causes, intent on making a quick buck or extracting whatever political power they can. Just look at Black Power icon Shaun King if you doubt my assessment of these people's honesty. Neo-Marxism, on the other hand, derives from the thinkers of the Frankfurt School, such as Theodor Adorno and Herbert Marcuse. Their ideas developed in the post-World War II period, where they each were influenced by Marxist thinking but mixed it with the psychological ideas of Freud in an attempt to understand what had caused the fascist and National Socialist movements of mid-century Europe. Adorno and Marcuse themselves might be the most influential thinkers of the modern leftist movement, perhaps even surpassing Marx in terms of affecting how people approach and interact with dissenters. If you've ever wondered why the modern left loves to ad hoc diagnose their opponents and psychologize disorders in anyone who disagrees, we can attribute that to the neo-Marxists. This is all to say that the ideal of leftist ideology, which presents itself as an unassuming, we're all in this together, collectivist mentality that eschews hierarchy and inequality, is a complete lie. The reality is that the kind of society that they want to impose requires, as a necessity, a totalizing level of top-down control from the state. We can see this in every variation of socialism or communism that was tried in the 20th century. But what drives this endless quest for social engineering? Sociologist and political theorist Paul Gottfried considers the defining difference between the left and the right is that the right recognises the inherent inequality between human beings as something inescapable, embedded within human nature, whereas the left has an egalitarian view of human nature, where it is malleable. They believe that we are all equal as a rule, and that any differences that arise are due to malicious intent. The right does not share this opinion, as exemplified by Murray Rothbard's essay, Egalitarianism as a Revolt Against Nature, which says it all, really. Under the leftist framework, there is no such thing as a meaningful difference that could separate people, either genetically or culturally, and any attempt to preserve the hierarchy that emerges from this fact is immoral, because it distorts humanity's true nature. Some, like Samuel Francis, have contested this conclusion, claiming that in reality no one, save for perhaps a few naive fools, the useful idiots you may say, actually believe in the possibility of this equality, and the thought leaders use this as a smokescreen through which to replace the current prejudices and biases of the day with their own preferred biases. As the events ahead will show, a combination of these ideas is probably close to the truth. In practice, this means that individuals on the left, no matter their idea of human nature, will always hold differing visions of how to even out the inequality in the world, and will fight over who gets to hold the reins of power. Hence, we see the great atrocities of Soviet Russia and revolutionary China, the famines, the purges, the bloodshed, as each tries desperately to reshape man in their ideal form. If you disagree with their methods, it turns out you're just not dedicated enough to the cause, and your attempts to preserve bourgeois ideology prove your illicit rightism, and you too will be purged, sent to the gulag, or just shot. And this brings us to the current era of online leftist infighting, which is its own distinct beast. With the advent of the internet, the role and aesthetic of the intellectual has changed. No longer are the youths getting their ideology from stuffy-looking, bearded, middle-aged men. Instead, they're being sold the revolution by glamorous online stars, propagandizing from their bedroom fitted with all the frills that modern luxury will afford them. Leftists aren't even shooting each other anymore, at least not in the same numbers. Instead, they cancel each other, organising mass mobs to attack their personal reputations, get them fired from their job, or trying to get sponsors to drop offenders. Like Mao's China, these spats offer a path to redemption, however. This path involves publicly flagellating yourself to the progressive cause and realigning yourself with the new status quo. The more grovelling and public the apology, the better. Examples of this are everywhere. Look no further than how many times ContraPoints has been cancelled for gently extending a toe past the line of acceptable progressive discussion. A few years ago, ContraPoints made the point that spending time with non-progressives was actually easier because they spend no time fussing over pronouns, unlike progressives. This led to a dogpile on Twitter, something Contra made an hour-long video about. ContraPoints always gets forgiven though, as some people have the clout to carry them through troubled times. J.K. Rowling presents an interesting case as well. Before her coming out as a gender-critical TERF, she was Queen Bee of the radical feminist progressive movement, and she had countless Pink News write-ups on her iconic takedowns of bigoted conservatives online. And make no mistake, Rowling is still a radical feminist progressive, but her radical feminism found itself grinding uncomfortably against the genderqueer views of trans activists, and so her sensible criticism of the modern trans movement, demanding trans-affirming bathrooms and encouraging minors to transition, have devastated her mainstream reputation. Not only has she been removed from respectable public discourse on trans issues, she's even been pushed out from Harry Potter, her own franchise. This is similar to Scott Cawthon, creator of Five Nights at Freddy's, after it was leaked publicly that he had financially supported Republican political candidates. Unlike Cawthon, who simply retired and sailed into the sunset with his millions of dollars, and fair play to him, Rowling has stuck around to fight for her ideals. Even though I disagree with many of her views, I can't help but respect her for sticking up for her beliefs, even at the threat of public smears and reputational ruin. It's important to note that Rowling has never expressed scorn or hatred towards trans individuals. She simply stated her concerns about where the movement was heading. What the left is undertaking every time they expel people from their orthodoxy, even a once high priestess like J.K. Rowling, is a cleansing ritual, signalling to everybody where the acceptable boundaries of conversation now are, and what happens when you stray from this new scripture. The guiding principle tends to be no enemies to our left, only our right. That they can remove someone like Rowling from her own franchise demonstrates that this principle currently rules, Even though she's still a leftist, Rowling said something that was just slightly to the right of acceptable discussion and faced the consequences. Combined with the power that comes with the left's capture of both elites and institutions, this principle makes them very dangerous and ensures the culture will continue to shift left without strong opposition from the right. We'll get into why there hasn't been strong opposition from the mainstream right in quite some time in just a bit. There are some who are unable to take their bruises and carry on like Rowling did, or who lack the clout and privileged identity of a ContraPoints. Take Lindsay Ellis, for example, whose tweet comparing Raya the Last Dragon to Avatar the Last Airbender was mobbed by assertions that the comparison was racist. She then continued to dig a hole for herself when her response contained the word squint, which was surely only more evidence of her blatant racism. Ellis then created an hour-and-a-half-long video addressing the accusations, and at the time of writing has deleted her Twitter account and not produced any content in 8 months. This is all especially ironic after she eagerly joined a dogpile against J.K. Rowling the year before for her perceived transphobia. The most recent victim that I can think of is Ethan Klein, who was cancelled very briefly by his audience for making fun of a gay man who called into his show by asking whether he was a bottom or not. This apparently warranted such a fearsome reaction that on the next episode of his podcast, he had lost his sponsors. However, Ethan apologised, realigned himself to the current absurd dogma, and carried on like nothing had happened. Later on, going on to make jokes about how the NRA meeting should be bombed, only a few weeks later, that didn't receive any consequences from YouTube. For those not on side, these consequences for stepping out of line can seem very confusing and inconsistent. Why should Ethan get a free pass when J.K. Rowling doesn't? It seems that it depends on both your willingness to bow down to the ideology and repent, and your usefulness to the regime as a whole. Despite all of the potential problems he introduces, Ethan has a very large audience, is willing to collaborate with socialists like Hassan Piker, and is just smart enough to be able to memorize and parrot talking points while being too dumb to actually question them. He's too useful an idiot to be cut from the movement. But when he outlives his usefulness, the right comment from 5 years ago will be unearthed to oust him. I do not highlight all of this as a simple means of rubbing it in the left's face that they're ideological Puritans that throw allies to the curb the second they contradict any of their prevailing beliefs. That may all be true, but no. In fact, we must recognise and focus on how the left has consistently won the political and cultural battles of the past century and a half, despite all of this infighting. Even when the right has been in charge, it has ceded ground to the left constantly. So we're now in a position where someone like Tom Harwood, a supporter of trans kids, can call himself a conservative. Why is this? To understand, we must acknowledge that there has been plenty of infighting within the right for a long time. Alongside the typical interpersonal conflicts that emerge between people operating within politics, the most damaging split in the right to emerge from the 20th century is based in ideology. Specifically, the split between the old right paleoconservatives and the neoconservatives of the 50s through to the 1990s, which was a fight that the neoconservatives won. Neoconservatism served to push the cultural challenges fought by the right to the left. Despite being close enough to a conservative himself, for example, F.A. Hayek considered conservatives to be unprincipled people who adopt at appropriate intervals of time those ideas made respectable by radical propaganda. And this could not apply more aptly to neoconservatives. Former Chronicles editor Thomas Fleming sums this up more clearly. They, the official conservatives, have established a cosy relationship with leftist establishment media who recognise them for what they are: safe and well-groomed lapdogs who bark but never bite. When the day comes that they are no longer needed, these conservatives will be treated like a lower-class sweetheart picked up for a summer affair. I can only hope they're given car fare for the long ride home back to their side of town. This desperation to be accepted by the establishment has bred a new principle for the mainstream right, a deformed mirror image of the leftist principle of no enemies to my left, instead creating a few enemies to my far left, only enemies to my right. This militant moderation has left the right in tatters. Samuel Francis attributes this, in the introduction to his essay collection Beautiful Losers, to the change of political tactics the right adopted in the post-war period. In their attempt to win elections and fight communists, the right abandoned the principles and philosophy of the old right in favour of more Machiavellian, practical tactics. While this did have its success, without an ideological backbone and guiding philosophy, the right was left weak to every charge of moral indiscretion levied at it, eroding whatever values they were trying to conserve. The practical reality is that the leaders of the movement wanted to remain respectable in the eyes of the mainstream media, but sadly, respectability involved bowing down to all progressive demands and putting up a half-hearted fight publicly to save face for your supporters. By the time thinkers like Francis were commenting on this in the 80s, the subversion was complete and the institutions captured. The headquarters of neoconservative attacks on principled right-wingers was William Buckley Jr.'s publication The National Review, whose modus operandi was to accuse their enemies, anyone to the right of them, of anti-Semitism. That many neoconservatives were ex-Trotskyites did not seem to alarm anyone at the time, but it's around this time in the 1950s that mainstream conservative thought began shifting ever increasingly leftward at a pace it hadn't before. Among the most shocking accusations from these people was a smear in the 1990s against Pat Buchanan, who had committed the moral sin of criticising the Israeli government and the US's support of it, prompting Buckley to come out of retirement and write a treatise for the National Review called In Search of Anti-Semitism. Samuel Francis was similarly blacklisted after accusations of racism came from Dinesh D'Souza and the Centre for Equal Opportunity. This damaging trend continues even to this day. In January of 2020, Chronicle's associate editor Pedro Gonzalez was accused of anti-Semitism for posting a tweet mocking the physiognomy of David Rothschild. Who was this accuser? Was it David Baddiel? Owen Jones? The ADL perhaps? No, it was in fact Douglas Murray. In an article entitled When the Right Plays with Jew Hate, Douglas extrapolated from this one tweet that Pedro was none other than an out-and-out anti-Semite. Excerpts from the article include accusing Gonzalez of being thrilled at the opportunity to revive execrable motifs and notions that recall Nazi eugenicists and their obsession with Über and Untermenschen, and the rather remarkable statement that his odious game playing, which is now everywhere in our culture, is not violence, but it is a kind of proto-violence. This from somebody supposedly dedicated to fighting cancel culture and exaggerated cause of violence from the left. The banner of this article was topped with a swastika, just in case you were unsure of the message. This, all despite the fact as well that physiognomy is the go-to Twitter insult for Gonzalez, no matter his opponent. In an effective rebuttal to these charges, Chronicles published That Old Anti-Semitism Smear, calling out Douglas for engaging with these tactics and damaging the right-wing movement. It shouldn't need pointing out, but Chronicles' current editor, Paul Gottfried, who came to Pedro's support, is Jewish, and one of the first publications to stick up for Gonzalez is The Hebrew Conservative, who similarly accused Douglas of spurious accusations based on pretty flimsy evidence. I honestly do not see this kind of purity testing, zealotous cleansing of the movement, especially using the potentially career-threatening smear of anti-Semitism, doing anything other than harming the true right-wing in an attempt to appear respectable to the left. It's how we've got to the point where every potential candidate for Conservative leader in the UK is now an embarrassment to the meaning of conservatism. What I think we need, ideally, is a new cabal of conservative elites of the old right variety to overcome the institutional barriers that have been put up by infiltrating parties, making some uncomfortable noise by appealing to traditional values like truth and virtue, and changing the hearts and minds of both the elite and the people. How realistic and achievable this is questionable. The trials of Pat Buchanan and Samuel Francis have shown that what is conservative one day can be considered radical and bigoted the next, not just by the left, but by your supposed allies as well, who will be just as eager to throw you under the bus in exchange for the respect of those that hate them. Ultimately, the left has no interest in seeming respectable to the right, but the establishment right is unable to function without the approval of the elite, and this is why they fail. We must throw aside these failures and abandon all hope of respectability in the eyes of the elite left. I mean, why would we want respect from warmongers and paedophiles anyway? We must present a radical and moral alternative. In the words of Rothbard, it behooves us to pay attention to which right-wing strategy most frightens and agitates leftists and liberals. What sends them up the wall? Sober nuts and bolts appeals to beltway elites for marginal reform, or passionate, emotional appeals to the masses for radical change? exclusive concentration on marginal tax cuts or narrow changes in health proposals, or calls to take back our culture, technical marginalia, or raising the standard of ferocious opposition on basic morals and culture? To ask these questions is to answer them. This has been Trump's most obvious virtue, and it seems to be working for Ron DeSantis as well, so perhaps the winds are changing. I can only hope so. As history has shown us, the left eating itself only leads to it being more powerful, whereas the right doing the same leads us soulless, aimless, and losing.